This is the Sikakeyb HM80, a new challenger in the highly oversaturated Hall effect keyboard market. Now, while Sikakeyb is a smaller brand in the keyboard world, they've definitely made a name for themselves here with the HM80, as instead of just releasing another generic Hall effect keyboard like many brands have done, especially recently, Sikakeyb designed the HM80 in such a way they'll be a direct competitor to the high performance boards we see from the bigger names in the keyboard world, such as Wooting, Drunketeer, and Newfie. And based off my experience with the board, Sikakeyb has done exactly what they set out to do here with the HM80, as the board feels like a no compromise high performance board with amazing quality, performance, and overall feel, and it is without a doubt the best Hall effect keyboard I've used to date. So in today's video we're going to take a deep dive and talk all about the HM80's pros and cons, as well as highlight the many unique features of this board, such as its built-in screen. But before we dive in, I want to say a big thank you to Sikakeyb for sending over the HM80 for review. As always, this video will be fully subtitled and timestamped, so if you're looking for a particular topic about the HM80, be sure to check the chapters down below. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more keyboard reviews like this one, be sure to leave a like on the video and get subscribed. I plan on covering a lot more keyboards in 2025, so if there's a specific board you guys want to see me cover or a specific switch, be sure to let me know down in the comments. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. Alright, so to start off, let's talk about performance. As I mentioned earlier, the HM80 is designed to be an extremely high performance board, and as it's designed, the board felt fantastic and performed great across the board in both gaming and just general use situations. The board's ergonomics are also quite good, and it's very comfortable to use in all use cases. The stock keycaps are decently grippy, making it easy to anchor your fingers on them while typing, and the board's performance features are stellar. It's also worth noting that the HM80 is also hot swappable and compatible with all magnetic switch types, but I'll talk more about the board's hot swappability and its other various features later in this video. Now, in terms of actual performance tech, the HM80's Hall effect technology implementation is also fantastic, significantly better than the other boards I've used. As we've talked about many times here on the channel before, boards like the HM80 that allow you to customize the actuation point of the switches are incredibly impactful when it comes to in-game performance, as you can set movement, action, or ability buttons to actuate with as little travel as 0.01 millimeters, making them actuate essentially instantly. This allows you to not only move more efficiently in games, but it also makes your movements much more precise. The performance improvements from a Hall effect board are most noticeable in fast-paced FPS games or games that rely on a lot of precise movements. This adjustable actuation feature also makes hitting frame precise abilities much more consistent, as the magnetic keys can actuate much faster than traditional mechanical switches due to their adjustable nature. In my opinion, aside from getting a high refresh rate monitor, getting a Hall effect magnetic keyboard like the HM80 is one of the most impactful upgrades you can get for your setup, as these types of boards perform astronomically better than the traditional mechanical boards, and as I mentioned earlier, the HM80 in particular performs much better than every other magnetic board I've tested as well. In terms of unboxing, the HM80 comes in a fairly standard packaging. Inside we have the board itself, and then under the board there is a quick start guide that explains some of the board's shortcuts as well as some other miscellaneous information. Also included with the board is a standard USB A to C cable that is braided, a keycap switch puller combo, which is actually really nice to see included as it makes swapping these switches on the HM80 very easy, plus an extra gray escape key. Now, out of the box, the HM80 will come with a standard spacebar installed, but one feature I really love about this board is that it also comes with an optional tri-split spacebar, as well as extra switches and stabilizers for it. This allows you to replace the standard spacebar on the board with a 3-button one, adding 2 extra buttons to the board. These extra buttons can be bound to other keys, which then can be bound to various in-game actions, which is a very neat feature, but I'll talk more about this in a moment. Now, before I talk more about the rest of the board, I wanted to quickly talk about the board's colorway. Now, currently the HM80 only comes in this gray, very 90s style colorway. Now, personally, I love this colorway as it reminds me of the old IBM keyboards I used to game on when I was younger. However, I can definitely see the board's colorway turning a lot of people off from the HM80, as other high performance boards come in black, white, or other more visually aesthetic colorways. Another issue is that the HM80's housing isn't a very complementary color, being that tan gray color I just mentioned, so if you want to customize the appearance of the board with different keycaps, you're very limited into what colors you can use, as black and white and other standard color keycaps look quite bad in contrast to the board's housing. So while I personally love the HM80's 90s style colorway, I can definitely see where this board falls short visually when compared to other high performance boards that are available on the market. Hopefully we'll see Sikakeyb make a black, white, or space gray colorway for the frame and the keycaps in the future, as those colors would look much better visually and would better compete with the aesthetics of the other high performance boards available on the market. Alright, next up let's talk board construction. The board's upper and lower housings is is made out of ABS plastic. In all honesty, considering the price of the HM80, I'm a little disappointed to see this. I do wish the board's housing was made of aluminum or a more durable material than the ABS plastic, as the current material tarnishes very easily when used, but unlike the outside of the board, the internal construction is actually very solid. Inside the board, starting from the top, we have an aluminum positioning plate, and then we have a Slim Flex, formerly Poron pad underneath that, an IXPE switch pad, the main board's PCB with another layer of Slim Flex foam beneath that, and then below that a full silicone base pad. So while the outer housing is rather disappointing, the internal construction of the HM80 is fantastic, and the silicone and Slim Flex layers gives the HM80 fantastic stock acoustics, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Alright, next up let's talk build quality in QC. The board feels pretty much perfect out of the box, all the keys feel very well implemented, and there are no significant issues with the board's overall build. However, as I just mentioned earlier, the top and bottom housings are made of ABS plastic which just scuff and tarnish pretty easily. I somehow managed to get some black marks on the top of my housing, which is quite disappointing, and since it's ABS plastic, it's very difficult to clean. Again, an aluminum housing would have been much better in my opinion, like the aluminum top housing we saw in the Lightning 60HE, as it's much more resistant to scuffing and wear and tear. Another slight nitpick I have with the board's overall build quality is that on the top shell here, where there's this little housing between the arrow keys and the rest of the board, this section is very loose, and if you press on it, it moves significantly. I'd love to see this stabilized a little more, as I have boards that are 1/4 the price of the HM80 that have much better stabilization in this area. But aside from those two little nitpicks, the board overall feels fantastic, and again, its build quality, both internal and external, aside from the outer shell, is fantastic. Alright, let's dive into the HM80's features next. The board is an 80% layout with 80 keys, 82 if you use the split spacebar. I actually quite like the split spacebar, as I mentioned earlier, as you can use the extra 2 buttons for actions in-game, or use them as utility keys for work such as swapping desktops or pretty much whatever you want. Admittedly, it does take some time to get accustomed to the extra spacebar buttons, but once you get used to it, the tri-split spacebar is a fantastic feature I wish we saw on more boards, specifically high-performance ones. In terms of connectivity, as expected for a high-performance board, it only supports wired USB-C connectivity. There is no wireless or Bluetooth connectivity available on the board. The board does have full per-key lighting. It does have a little light bar above the arrow keys that I pointed out earlier. All of the lights on the board are fully customizable and assignable to different layers on the keyboard. The board also has that little built-in screen I mentioned earlier, which is an incredibly useful little screen, as it can be used for a bunch of different functions here in the HM80, but I'm going to talk about the screen's functions later in this video, as that's a little bit of a separate topic. Now, since the board is a magnetic board, it uses Hall sensors to measure the magnetic force generated by the board switches, Gateron Jade Pros in this case, to determine a keystroke. Now, the board by default supports an adjustable actuation range of 0.1 to 4 millimeters with 0.01 millimeter steps, but this range might be shorter on some magnetic switches, as the stock Jade Pros that are included have an actuation range of 0.01 to 3.5 millimeters, 0.5 millimeters shorter than what the board supports. Now, the board also does of course support SOCD and a bunch of other performance features, and according to Sikakeyb, the board natively scans at 8K Hz as expected, but interestingly enough, there is no way to adjust the board's scan rate like there was on other high performance boards, such as the Pulsar PC MK2HE. Alright, now in terms of the HM80 stock switches, as I just mentioned, the board comes with the Gateron Jade Pro switches by default. Currently, that is the only switch option for this board, but as I mentioned earlier, the board is fully hot swappable and compatible with all current magnetic switches that are available on the market, so if you want to use a specific magnetic switch here with the HM80, you absolutely can. Now, I recently covered the Jade Pro switches a couple weeks ago, along with the Jade Gaming and Jade Max switches, and out of the whole lineup, the Jade Pros were my second favorite of the bunch, as they were a very solid feeling and performing switch. In terms of their specific specifications, their initial force is 36 plus minus 5 gram force, their bottom up pressure is 50 plus minus 10 gram force, their total travel range is 35 plus minus 0.1 millimeters, their actuation range, as I mentioned earlier, is 0.01 to 3.5 millimeters. They are a linear switch type, and they're using an MX style stem. Their top housing is semi-transparent, and their bottom housing is a solid blue-green. They use a 2-pin mounting mechanism, and they are pre-lubed out of the box, and they are rated for over 100 million keystrokes. Now, not only do the Jade Pros feel and perform amazingly, they also sound amazing when combined with the HM80 stock acoustics. I'll give you a quick sound test here for you with the Jade switches. Now keep in mind, I haven't modded my HM80 at all, so this gorgeous creamy thunk sound is completely stock, which is very impressive for a board's stock acoustics. Now while the Jade Pro switches sounded and performed amazingly, I did replace them with my favorite switch out of the Jade lineup, the Jade Maxes. As well, they perform one for one with the Jade Pros in my opinion. They have a fully clear housing, so they complement the HM80's lighting better, and they're rated for a higher overall lifespan than the Jade Pros, being rated for over 150 million keystrokes. But again, the Jade Pros and Jade Maxes are very similar, and considering how well the stock Jade Pros feel and sound and perform here on the HM80, most people won't feel the need to replace the stock switches, but again, if you want to, since the board is fully hot swappable with all magnetic switches that are currently available on the market. Next up, let's talk keycaps. The HM80 stock keycaps are one of the better feeling stock keycaps I've used. The keycaps are made out of PBT and they are fully solid, so there's no transparency for the board's RGB to shine through. All the keycaps do use a standard MX style stem, and the keycaps have a rougher, more granular surface to them, similar to what we saw in the Apple Maker TH80 SE's keycaps, but much rougher and much grippier in my opinion. And because of this, the HM80 keys, as I mentioned earlier, are very grippy, very well optimized for dry hands and okay for sweaty hands, but very usable in my opinion. And without a doubt, they're the best stock keycaps I've seen included with a board, at least from what I've personally tested. But if you dislike the more granular keycaps with their very nostalgic colorway, since the stock switches use standard MX style stems, you can swap the keycaps out for whatever you'd like to use. Personally speaking, since the board has such good lighting, shine through or pudding keycaps would look the best, but finding an aftermarket set of keycaps that will complement the 90s style colored housing here on the HM80 might be a little tricky, as I talked about earlier. And speaking of keycaps, let's talk ergonomics next. The HM80 is an averagely tilted board, similar to the tilt we saw in the Apple Maker TH80 SE, just slightly less aggressive. The board's keycap profile is cherry-like, being a flatter, less rounded keycap profile, and in combination with the board's tilt, the board is very comfortable to type on. Now over my testing, I just use the board flat as I do with all of my keyboards, but if you want the board to be more aggressively forward tilted, you can raise the board 2 levels via the board's adjustable feet. However, while the board is very comfortable to type on and use for gaming, I wanted to note that on lower actuation points, depending on where you place your hands, it's very easy to accidentally actuate the Control, Windows, and Alt keys with your palm. If you have issues with this, you can prevent this by setting the actuation point of the issue keys to 2mm or higher, where they're still actuatable if need be, but not so low where they're easy to misactuate. I did run into a couple issues with this over my testing, but just adjusting the actuation point of the issue switches resolved this completely. And again, this issue isn't unique to the HM80. I've had this issue on other high performance boards as well, but I just wanted to mention this in case you have any problems with this. Alright, next up let's talk about the HM80's built-in screen, as this is one of my favorite parts of the board aside from its tri-split keyboard. The screen is on the smaller size, being only 1.14 inches large, but despite being small, the screen is quite useful. Now there are 4 primary use cases for the built-in screen. Firstly, you can use the built-in screen to play a little game. The game is similar to the Chrome offline T-Rex game, but this version is like the Dark Souls versions of that game. Also, there's just a Doge face inexplicably floating in the sky, but the cool thing about this game is that it reacts to the force of the keystrokes. So if you quickly press down, you'll jump higher, and if you lightly press, you'll do a short hop, which I thought was a kind of unique twist to the Chrome offline game. Next, the mini screen can be used as a mini reaction test game, similar to the one we saw in Human Benchmark, just based off the keys of the keyboard, not a mouse click. The built-in screen can also be used to show a small switch tester or profiler, which displays the specs on the switch's keystroke, its actuation, which is a very useful feature for testing switches and different actuation points. For example, when I was testing the Jade switches, being able to put all 3 of them on the board and use this to kind of determine the differences between them was very helpful. And lastly, the screen can be used as a mini display for a GIF. Now there are several GIFs built in, but you can create and upload your own to display on the board, and it will just play in a loop, which is an awesome little feature. Now I will say the process for getting the GIF on the board can be a little tricky, but I'll talk about that later in this video. Now to switch between the different functions for this built-in display, you can use function plus page up or page down to toggle between the switch tester, reaction game, T-Rex game, or the GIF display. Alright, next up let's talk about the HM80's lighting a little more in depth. As I mentioned earlier, the HM80 has full per key lighting and a light bar above the arrow keys. All the board's lighting looks absolutely fantastic. It's probably one of the nicest lighting implementations I've seen on a board, particularly the light bar. I really like that. But the per key lighting is heavily reduced due to the solid non-shine through keycaps. Now for those of you who've been watching the channel for a long time, you'll know I'm not the biggest fan of super RGB heavy keyboards, so I don't mind the more muted lighting here, but if you want to show more of the board's lighting, you can use clear keycaps or putting keycaps on the board, which will look much better in terms of lighting, but again, finding a keycap color that complements the coloring of the board's outer housing is a little tricky. Now, the lighting can be assigned to one of the 5 onboard layers on the HM80. For me, I just changed the lighting style on my work and gaming profile so I could tell what layer I was using, as the board doesn't tell you otherwise, which I thought was kind of odd given the built-in display, but regardless, you can get around this by using the lighting. But you can do pretty much whatever you want with the lighting here in the HM80, and it's very customizable. Again, the only real issues with the board's lighting is that the actual per key lighting is very muted due to the keycaps. Next up, let's talk about the HM80's software. Now, given that this is a high-performance board, I expect the software to be very feature-rich, but the software experience is quite confusing due to its layout, and there are several quirks with it. Now, as of this review, there is only a local software available for the HM80. There is no web-based software currently. Now, by default, the software will show Chinese as the language, so you will need to change that, and you can do this by opening up the software and clicking this globe icon at the top right and then selecting your preferred language. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the board does support 5 onboard profiles or layers. Each layer can have its own lighting, actuation force, keystroke settings, etc., and you can swap between the layers either via the software or the board itself by pressing function plus Z, X, or C, but using the keyboard itself, you can only swap between the first 3 layers. The 4th and 5th layer will have to be toggled via the software. Now, because the board doesn't tell you what layer you're using, I'd recommend assigning unique lighting to each of your layers so you can tell what mode you're using without having to rely on the software. Now, inside the software, there are 4 primary tabs. Firstly, we have the function tab. This is where you can assign keybinds, etc. on the board, and where you'd add the extra spacebar buttons if you opt to install the split spacebar. There are also a bunch of switch options here as well, such as SOCD, or the ability to bind different keystrokes to a single key depending on how hard you press down. There are a bunch of other configuration options too, but for time's sake I'm not going to talk about them today. Next, we have the performance tab. Firstly, here we can see a digitized version of the switch tester that the HM80 has on board. In this tab, you can adjust the actuation points for every key on the board. Again, this board supports 0.01mm to 4mm actuation points. This tab also shows you what keys are set to what actuation points, and you can either manually set the actuation points or you can use the preset values for the board, and you can assign different values to each layer, so you can have a board run at normal actuations for general use on one layer and faster actuation points for gaming on another layer. Next up, we have the calibration tab. Now, I'm going to skip this one for now, but I'll talk about this tab's use in a moment. And lastly, we have the lighting tab, which is pretty self-explanatory, as here you can configure and customize the board's per key lighting, the light bar, and as I mentioned earlier, you can set different lighting to different layers as well. In this tab, you can also set the image for the board's built-in display here by clicking on the top right of the board where the screen would be in the software. Then you can either pick a GIF that comes pre-installed or upload your own. If you're going to upload your own though, it's important to note that the GIF has to be a GIF, image, or PNG or BMP format, and it has to be in a 16:9 resolution. Now, I find I had to repeat the process of setting a custom GIF in the board a couple times before the board actually accepted it. Not really sure why, but if you try and do this and it doesn't accept it the first time, just keep trying it and the board will eventually recognize it. And lastly, let's quickly circle back to that calibration tab next. This tab is used to calibrate the HM80 to different switch types, and you'll need to go through this calibration process each time you swap the board's switches. Now, the process itself is pretty simple. All you need to do is, of course, install the new switches and make sure they're installed properly, but I'd avoid installing the keycaps in case there are any issues with the switches during the calibration process. Next, go back to that performance tab we talked about earlier and press the select switch button and set the max actuation range for the new switches. For example, the Jade Pro's max range for actuation is 3.5mm, so you'd set it to 3.5mm. If the switches you're installing have a higher or lower value, be sure to assign it to that. Next, go back to the calibration tab and press the start button. Then you have to fully actuate every button on the board. Now, it's very important that you fully actuate the switch. Don't press the switch halfway down, as you can improperly calibrate the switch by doing so. Once the switch has been successfully calibrated, it will turn blue. If there's an issue, it will turn red, in which case I'd recommend reinstalling the switch and recalibrating it. Once the calibration process is complete, the board's lighting will turn off. A little notification will pop up in the software saying the calibration process is complete, and then you can go ahead and reinstall your keycaps and use your board with your new switches. Alright, well, in closing, overall the HM80 is a fantastic magnetic board that's incredibly feature rich, and of course it performs incredibly well. Easily the best magnetic board I've personally tried to date, and of course, while it's not everyone's cup of tea, I love the nostalgic colorway, but the board should absolutely come in some more standard colorways like black, white, or a non-vintage gray. But aside from the colorway, the board does have some other shortcomings in my opinion. First, I do think given the board's price, the top shell and ideally the bottom shell as well should be made of a more durable material. The top housing around the arrow keys and the light bar should also be much better stabilized as it wobbles and sags quite badly, and while the software is very feature rich and the most complete software I've used for a magnetic board, the software is very confusing and very hard for new users to learn. I definitely think that the software should be updated to make it clear to the user what everything does and how to customize the board, but the software is a common pitfall for many high performance boards, so this isn't exactly surprising. But aside from those issues, the HM80 is overall a fantastic board with amazing performance. It can of course be a little hard to use at first due to the software, but once you get accustomed to it, it's absolutely fantastic, and the fact that the board is hot swappable is amazing as it allows for even more customization in terms of the board's feel and performance. I also wanted to highlight again that the stock acoustics for the boards are absolutely fantastic, and it's not only the best performing magnetic board I've personally tested, it's also the best sounding. But if you'd like to learn more about the HM80, I'll have a couple product pages linked down in the description for you all. Alright, well that's going to be everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much again to Sikakeyb for sending over the HM80 for review. I'll definitely keep a very close eye on them going forward, and I'll definitely cover any of their future releases here on the channel if I can get my hands on them. Big thank you to our channel members Yuki89, Prince, It Was Luck, and Lunaris. Our channel members make what I do here on the channel possible with the in-depth reviews and the Teardown project, so thank you very much to all of our channel members for your continued support. If you'd like to support the channel, you can become a channel member here on YouTube for only $2 a month. That is one of the best ways to directly support the channel, or you can use code mel0n with a 0 over Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gear, Mech Keys, TJ exclusives to save yourself a couple bucks off your orders and help directly support the channel. Thanks for watching my review of the Sikakeyb HM80, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.